The whole town feared her. But when her uncle traded her for silver and left her with men who didn't care if she lived or died, something unexpected happened. She fought back, not with fists, but with something far more powerful. They called her cursed, but Miriam never argued, not because she believed it, but because arguing never changed anything. Folks made up their minds like they patched roofs, quick, sloppy, and sure would hold. And once the whispers started, they stuck like burrs to a hem. First, it was just her birth, how her mother bled out before even holding her. Then came the fire that burned down the family barn, her father trapped inside. The town preacher called it God's judgment. After that, even silence was a sentence. When Miriam was 16, a boy named Elijah gave her a red ribbon and kissed her beneath the willow tree near the church. 3 weeks later, he was dead, struck by lightning while trying to rope a runaway calf in the middle of a thunderstorm. She stopped talking after that, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one would hear her without already hearing doom in her voice. Then her brother was gored by a bull, his own bull, the gentlest of the lot, on the very day Miriam turned 18. The look her uncle gave her at the funeral wasn't grief. It was fear wrapped in blame. Now she lived alone, just past the mill road where the trees leaned like old women gossiping. Her cabin was plain, the garden behind it wild but useful. Chamomile for sleep, yarrow for bleeding, lavender for the few who still dared to buy her soaps and salves under the cover of dusk. No one stayed long. Children ran when they saw her shadow, and even stray dogs kept a distance. Miriam didn't blame them. It was easier that way. So when her uncle, red-faced and sweating, rode up with 2 men in army coats and dirty boots, she didn't flinch. One of them looked her up and down like she was cattle. The other just spat into the dirt and said, "You sure she's the one?" Her uncle nodded, not looking at her, just counting the coin in his palm. "Ain't no man'll marry her. Might as well be useful." They didn't bind her, just told her to come along. And she did. With her chin up and her hands steady, she packed a small satchel with dried herbs, a comb, and her mother's cracked mirror. The rest she left: the bed, the stove, the carved box where her brother once kept his letters. She didn't look back, not when the cabin disappeared behind the trees. Not when the road narrowed into dry grass and silence. The men talked around her, never to her. One joked about drawing straws. The other said he'd sleep with one eye open. Miriam kept walking, her boots kicking up dust, her braids swinging with each step. If they thought she was cursed, let them. If they thought they could use her, let them try. She had known loss, but she had also known quiet survival, the kind that didn't need words or weapons. And as the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline, casting everything in gold, Miriam told herself something she hadn't dared say in years. Not out loud, just inside, quiet as breath. I am still here. The days blurred into dry wind and hoofbeats, dust clinging to Miriam's skirt, sweat soaking the collar of her dress. The men who rode ahead of her weren't cruel, just careless. They didn't speak to her unless it was to bark an order or crack a joke she wasn't meant to understand. One of them, a wiry scout with broken teeth, called her witch woman when he thought she couldn't hear. Another spat every time she passed, but none of it stuck the way it used to. She had learned long ago that silence was better armor than anger. There was one among them who didn't laugh, didn't mock, a Lakota brave with dark eyes and a face made of stone. Chaska, they called him. He rode at the rear most days, watchful, quiet, his long braid tied back with a strip of faded red cloth. He didn't look at her the way the others did, like she was a thing, or worse, a threat. His gaze wasn't soft, but it wasn't cruel either. It was steady, like water smoothing the edge of a stone. When they camped the first night, the others sat around the fire, tossing bones and chewing dried meat. Miriam was left on the fringe, wrists still bound, knees drawn to her chest as the cold settled in. Her uncle had given them no instructions for her care, only said, "She's yours now," before riding off with his silver. So they treated her like the problem no one wanted to claim. She didn't expect kindness. That's why she flinched when a shadow stepped near, blocking the firelight. Chaska. He crouched slowly and placed a tin cup at her feet. Water. Cool. Clear. He didn't speak, just stood again and turned to leave. But before he could walk away, he paused, reached down and with one careful tug, loosened the knot around her wrists. The rope fell away, her skin red and raw beneath it. She stared at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, hoarse from dust and silence. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her, the fire flickering in his eyes. Then he said, "You look like you don't believe the lies they tell about you." His voice was rough, deep, the words broken but clear. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet understanding that left her throat tight. He was gone before she could respond, back to his place in the dark, sitting just beyond the reach of the fire, his back to the others, eyes on the stars. That night, Miriam didn't sleep much. Her wrists throbbed, but it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was the sound of her own thoughts, louder than they'd been in years. "You don't believe the lies." The words repeated in her head, over and over, until they no longer sounded like someone else's, until they started to sound like her own. The land stretched wide and empty in every direction, painted in browns and golds that shimmered under the sun. They rode through wind-blown mesas where the sky pressed close and hard, and through grasses so tall they whispered secrets to one another in the heat. Some days were dry and brittle, others damp with the threat of rain that never came. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint trace of sagebrush. Miriam kept to herself, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but her mind was alive with everything it saw. She didn't try to run, didn't lash out. That part of her had gone quiet. She knew how far towns lay between one another, how little mercy the prairie showed those who wandered alone. So instead, she paid attention to the way the scouts spoke in short, clipped sentences, to the way they handled their rifles, rested their hands on the hilts of knives without thinking, to the way food was rationed, to who always ate first, to who watched her too long when they thought no one else noticed. And she watched Chaska. He never joined the others when they drank or told stories. He rode on the edge of the group, sometimes near the front, sometimes trailing behind, always watching the horizon. His horse, a dark bay with a jagged white blaze on its nose, seemed to understand him without words. It moved like smoke, silent, smooth, never needing the pull of reins to know where to go. Miriam found herself watching them often, the man and the animal moving as one, like they were born from the same wind. When they stopped for the night, Chaska always built his fire a little away from the others, close enough to see them, far enough to be alone. Miriam's place was never decided, so she chose the same each time, between the group and the silence, within reach of both. The food they gave her was rough, hard biscuits, salted meat, but she chewed and swallowed without complaint. No one offered her more. No one asked how she was doing. Except once, when Chaska passed her an extra piece of jerky without a word. She took it, nodding, unsure if he'd even look back. But he did, just once. At night, long after the others had settled, she would lie beneath her thin blanket and listen. Wind moving through grass, horses shifting in their sleep. And sometimes Chaska's voice, low and steady, speaking in Lakota to the stars. The words were soft, almost like prayer, almost like song. She didn't understand a single one, but one sound came again and again, gentle and sure. It sounded like a name. The way he said it held weight, like something sacred. Miriam didn't ask what it meant. Not yet. Some things weren't meant to be rushed, but every time she heard it, something in her chest stirred, faint and unsure. Not fear, not quite hope either. Just a feeling that maybe, out here in the wild where no one knew her name, she could be something more than a curse. The storm came without warning, the kind that rips across the plains like it's got a grudge. One moment the sun burned the back of Miriam's neck, and the next, the sky split open, dark clouds rolling in like smoke from a far-off fire. The wind picked up sharp and sudden, bending the tall grass sideways and sending the horses into nervous circles. The scouts cursed and yanked at reins, but it was too late for control. Lightning cracked so close the air turned white. Thunder followed like a cannon blast, shaking the ground beneath their boots. One scout's horse reared and threw him hard, the sound of his body hitting earth drowned by the wind. Another turned and fled, riding for the hills without a word. No one stopped him. No one could. In the chaos, Miriam lost sight of everything. Rain came next, sharp as gravel, and she ran blind, hands over her ears, breath caught in her throat. She didn't think, didn't look back. She just ran until her legs gave out, and she dropped beneath a rocky ledge near the bend of a dry creek bed. The overhang gave little shelter, but it was enough to keep the worst of the wind off her. She curled into herself, shaking, palms pressed hard to the sides of her head as the sky roared above her. She didn't hear Chaska approach, didn't see him kneel beside her, only felt the quiet shift of the air when he crouched near the entrance, blocking the rain. He said nothing, didn't grab her or shout, just worked with slow, practiced movements, pulling dry kindling from his satchel, striking flint to steel until a thin, stubborn flame caught in the curve of his palm. He built the fire low, tucking it beneath a flat stone to keep it from the wind. The heat crept forward slowly, warming Miriam's damp sleeves, turning her shivers into stillness. He reached into his pack again, pulled out his own blanket, and draped it over her shoulders without asking. The wool smelled of horse, and smoke, and something green, like crushed pine needles. She didn't thank him, couldn't. Her throat felt locked tight. She just sat there, eyes on the fire, the storm still raging outside but somehow quieter now. After a while, she spoke. Her voice came out cracked and low, almost like she was speaking to the flames themselves. He died in a storm like this. Chaska didn't ask who, didn't press her for more. He just looked at her with that same steady calm and gave a small nod, as if he had known all along. They sat that way for a long time, saying nothing more, letting the fire do the talking. The thunder rolled on, the rain easing into a softer patter, and the night settled in slow around them. Outside, the world was still wild and unforgiving, but beneath the ledge, for just that moment, Miriam wasn't cursed, wasn't feared, wasn't alone. She was simply seen. The camp sat low in a wide valley, tucked between hills that broke the wind and held the morning sun a little longer than the world outside. Smoke rose in thin trails from cooking fires. Children darted between hide tents, and the air carried the soft rhythm of voices that didn't need to shout to be heard. Miriam's horse slowed as they approached, and she felt the weight of a dozen eyes drift toward her. She braced herself for the same thing she always felt when eyes turned her way: judgment, fear, distance. But it didn't come. No one pointed. No one whispered behind their hands. A few heads tilted, curious, not cruel. A small boy ran past, then doubled back, eyes wide as he reached out to touch the hem of her skirt before darting away with a giggle. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at Chaska, expecting him to ride ahead without a word. But he slowed too, guiding her gently to the heart of the camp, where a low fire crackled and an older woman stood stirring a pot. The woman looked up, her face weathered but kind, and said something in Lakota. Chaska answered with a slight nod, then stepped back. The woman studied Miriam for a breath, then held out a wooden bowl without ceremony. It smelled of rabbit, herbs, and something warm she couldn't name. Miriam took it with both hands, careful not to spill. The woman didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and she said, "Eat. You look hungry." The words were slow and accented but clear. Miriam sat where Chaska motioned, cross-legged beside the fire. She ate in silence, the soup thick and full of flavor, better than anything she'd tasted in months. Children played nearby, tossing stones into a woven ring, their laughter rising like birdsong. A young girl crept close and touched Miriam's braid, then whispered something before skipping away. Miriam blinked, unsure if this was a dream or just something she'd never been allowed to imagine. Later, Chaska's aunt returned with a bundle of cloth and a carved comb. Without asking, she sat behind Miriam and began to work through her tangled hair. Her hands were firm but gentle, separating strands with patience, humming low as she worked. "Little bird," the woman said softly, not unkindly, "hair like wind and fire, you are not what they say." Miriam didn't speak, didn't trust her voice not to crack. She just sat there, still as she could, feeling the careful tug of hands that didn't judge her, didn't fear her. And when a soft laugh escaped her lips, real, sudden, unguarded, it startled even herself. Across the fire, Chaska looked up. His eyes found hers, and something in his face changed. Not a full smile, not yet. But his mouth curved, just slightly, as if something in him loosened at the sound. He looked away a moment later, but Miriam saw it. And for the first time, she believed maybe someone could look at her and not see a curse, but something worth smiling at. The fire burned high in the center of the camp, casting gold across faces and flickering against the smooth curve of the drums. The beat was steady, low, like a heart buried deep in the earth. Voices rose around it, not loud, not shouting, just singing in a language Miriam didn't know but felt anyway. It moved through her bones, warm and strange and ancient. The stars blinked down from a sky so wide it made her feel small, but not in the way she was used to, not like something forgotten, but like something placed gently in the palm of the world. She sat near the edge of the gathering, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her knees drawn up to her chest. The Lakota around her didn't ask her to speak or join or even understand. They simply let her be there, as if that was enough. Chaska sat across the fire, his face still as carved stone, his eyes following the flames like they held secrets only he could read. He hadn't said much since they arrived back from the river earlier that day, where Miriam had helped gather water, slipping once on the rocks and laughing when she landed with a splash. Chaska had looked away then too, but not before she caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth. Now, with firelight dancing on his face and shadows stretching long behind him, she watched him closely. He was murmuring again, low and steady, like always. The same word. The one she'd heard on the trail, whispered into the night when he thought no one listened. She waited until the drum beat slowed and the songs faded to quiet hums. Then she rose, walked slowly around the fire, and sat beside him. He didn't flinch, just looked at her, like he'd known she would come. "What's the word?" she asked, her voice soft, the flames crackling between them. "The one you always say when you think I'm asleep." Chaska didn't answer right away. He reached for a stick and stirred the coals, watching the embers glow brighter beneath the ash. Then he spoke, quiet and sure. "Winona." She repeated it under her breath, the shape of it unfamiliar. "What does it mean?" He turned to her, his eyes steady in the firelight. "Desired one." Miriam scoffed, a sharp breath meant to deflect, but it didn't carry the strength it once did. She looked down, tugging the edge of the blanket tighter. "That can't be me." "You still believe they're curses," he said. "I don't." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw no doubt in his face, no mockery, just truth, offered without force. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But something inside her shifted, a long closed door creaking open just a little. The fire popped between them, sending sparks into the sky like tiny stars breaking free. Later, in the quiet of her sleeping mat, with the sound of drums still echoing faintly across the camp, Miriam closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she slept without fear. No dreams of fire or loss, no faces of the dead, just warmth, and a name that didn't feel cursed anymore. They came at dawn, the hooves kicking up dust, long before the figures came into view. 5 men on horseback, rifles slung across their backs, coats stiff with dust and pride. Miriam's heart dropped the moment she saw the lead rider. A crooked hat, a face like gristle, a mouth that never smiled unless someone else was hurting. Her uncle. She should have known he wouldn't let her go so easily, not with his name tied to her like a rope, not with his pride still bruised from her silence. The camp stirred as the riders approached. Children were pulled close. Men stepped forward with quiet readiness, no panic, just stillness that could turn sharp in an instant. Chaska stood near the edge of the fire circle, arms crossed, face unreadable. Miriam felt the weight of it all pressing against her chest but didn't move, didn't run. She had run all her life, and she was tired of it. Her uncle didn't dismount, just pulled his horse to a stop with a jerk and spat into the dirt. "I've come for the girl," he barked. "She's mine by blood, and she's dangerous. Ask anyone back home." His voice was thick with anger and something else. Fear, maybe, though he'd never admit it. "She'll bring death to you all," he went on, sweeping his gaze across the camp. "Everything she touches withers. First her mother, then her brother, then every man who's ever looked at her too long. It's not natural." The words didn't sting the way they used to. Miriam stood by the fire, her hands at her sides, her spine straight. She didn't argue, didn't plead. Just met her uncle's eyes and held his gaze until he looked away. The silence around her felt different now. Not the silence of shame, but of strength. The chief, an older man with silver in his braid and wisdom carved into the lines of his face, stepped forward. He listened to the words without blinking, then turned to Miriam. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air like the edge of a blade. "Do you want to stay?" It was a simple question, but to Miriam it was everything. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Not when she was sold, not when she was shamed, not when she was feared. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. She looked at Chaska, who didn't speak, didn't move, just watched her with that same quiet certainty that had carried her through the storm and into the fire. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I want to stay." The chief nodded once, and the decision was made. Her uncle's face turned red, his hands twitching toward his reins, but he knew better than to draw. He cursed under his breath and turned his horse around, the others following behind, the sound of their hooves fading into the hills. Miriam didn't move until the dust settled. Then, slowly, she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Around her, the camp returned to its rhythm. Chaska stepped beside her, not touching, not speaking, just near. And in that closeness, she felt something stronger than walls or weapons. She wasn't a curse here. She wasn't a prisoner. She was simply a woman who had chosen to stay. The air was too still before dawn, the kind of quiet that held its breath. Miriam woke to it, a prickle along her spine, the distant scent of something burning. She sat up slowly, eyes searching the horizon, the sky just beginning to pale at the edges. A horse whinnied low somewhere near the edge of camp, restless, uneasy. Then the silence broke. A shot rang out, loud, sharp, and too close. Screams followed. Hooves thundered through the valley. The settlers had come back, not to talk, not to bargain, but to take. Fire lit behind them, torches thrown into the dry grass, flames climbing fast as they raced toward the tents. Miriam didn't think, she ran. She darted through the camp, bare feet kicking up dust, heart slamming against her ribs. People scattered in every direction, mothers clutching children, warriors grabbing bows and rifles, smoke rising thick and fast. She ran for the river, where the trees would offer cover, where she thought safety might wait. But then she heard the shout. She turned and saw Chaska. He stood in the center of it all, alone, facing 3 settlers with rifles and cruel smiles. One raised his weapon. Miriam froze, her breath caught in her throat. Chaska didn't flinch, didn't step back, but he was outnumbered, outflanked. Her eyes landed on the spear lying by the fire pit, a training weapon meant for practice, its edge dulled from years of use. She didn't know how to throw it properly. She didn't stop to think. She grabbed it. The shaft was heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but her grip tightened. She sprinted closer, heart in her mouth, the noise around her a blur. She raised the spear high, aimed not at a man, but at the horse beneath him. Her arm trembled. She threw. The spear flew through the air, not straight, not fast, but enough. It landed with a hard crack just in front of one horse's hooves. The animal screamed, reared high, and its rider lost control, tumbling backward as the horse bolted. The chaos it caused broke the formation, scattered the others, just long enough for Chaska to move. He struck fast. One motion, clean and sharp, knocking the rifle from another settler's hands and forcing the last to retreat. Blood ran down his temple, but he stood tall, his breath steady, eyes finding hers across the smoke. She didn't wait for praise, didn't need it. She ran to him, helped him steady himself, her hands gripping his arm like it anchored her to the world. They didn't speak. The fire raged behind them. The settlers retreated. Their surprise turned to panic. Warriors from the camp regrouped, chasing the threat out beyond the hills. Later, when the flames were low and the camp smoldered with ash, Miriam sat beside Chaska near the river. Her hands still shook. Her dress was torn. But he looked at her, with something fierce in his eyes. Not surprise, not gratitude, but a deep, quiet pride. "You didn't run," he said. "Neither did you," she answered, and for the first time, they both smiled through the smoke. The sun rose slow over the valley, brushing everything in soft gold, but it did nothing to hide the wreckage left behind. Smoke still curled from the edge of the camp where tents had burned, the earth scorched black in places. The air smelled like ash and blood, and the silence that followed the fight was heavy, broken only by the cries of a baby, the low groan of someone wounded, the soft rustle of cloth as people began to rebuild what had been torn. 2 of the attackers had been captured. One had taken an arrow through the leg and now lay bound near the edge of camp, face pale, teeth clenched against the pain. The other sat staring at the fire with a look that had long since emptied itself of fight. One man had fled with a bleeding arm, and Miriam's uncle was gone. No one saw where he went, only that he'd turned his horse as the battle turned and rode into the rising dark like he never meant to return. Miriam found Chaska sitting beneath a tree near the river, his back against the trunk, his shirt dark with blood along his left arm. His jaw was set, his eyes calm, but she could tell the pain was there beneath the surface. She knelt beside him without a word, pulled the satchel of herbs from her belt, and began to clean the wound with the gentleness of someone who had learned to care in silence. He didn't flinch, didn't speak until the bandage was tied tight. Then he looked at her and said, "You didn't run." She sat back on her heels, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You didn't either." His mouth twitched just slightly, not quite a smile, but close, the kind of look that carried something deeper than thanks. The fire crackled nearby, casting flickers of light across his cheek, across the cloth that held his arm tight to his side. That night, after the injured were tended and the children lay curled up in their shelters, Miriam sat beside the low fire with Chaska once more. She watched the flames dance and the sparks rise like stars caught in the wind. Her hands were stained, her sleeves torn, her body sore in places she hadn't noticed until now. "I'm tired of being feared," she said quietly. Her voice was small but sure. The words pulled from a part of her she'd kept hidden for too long. Chaska didn't answer right away. He stirred the fire with a stick, watched the embers shift and glow. Then he looked at her, his eyes soft in the firelight, his voice steady. "Then let them fear what they don't understand," he said. "But not you." She didn't respond, just stared into the fire, letting his words settle into the cracks of her heart. For once, she didn't feel like a curse, didn't feel like something broken. She felt like a woman who had stood her ground and was still standing. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The days after the fire moved slowly, but not with grief, with purpose. Ash was swept aside, broken poles replaced, hides stretched and restitched. The camp breathed again, not whole, not untouched, but alive. Miriam helped wherever she could, her hands blistered from work, her knees stained with dirt, but no one pushed her away. No one told her she didn't belong. They simply showed her what needed doing and let her learn. She sat with the elder women in the mornings, watching how they crushed roots with flat stones, how they sorted herbs by touch and smell. She learned how to make poultices that cooled fever and teas that calmed the heart. She asked questions when she didn't understand, and no one laughed at her stumbles. When her hands trembled from exhaustion, one woman pressed a piece of sweet root into her palm and said, "Even strong things bend." By afternoon, she worked by the river, weaving cattail into mats that dried soft and sturdy in the sun. A young girl with quick fingers taught her the patterns, showing how to twist and knot without snapping the strands. Sometimes they worked in silence, sometimes they sang. And once, when Miriam started to hum a tune from childhood, the girl joined in, matching her without knowing the words. The children followed her now, curious and bold. They tugged at her skirt, asked for stories, brought her little gifts, pebbles shaped like hearts, feathers, bits of bone. She told them tales of the wind, of foxes that stole moonlight, of girls who ran faster than thunder. Their laughter filled the spaces where fear used to live. Chaska watched from a distance most days, but he was never far. One morning, he offered her a hand and nodded toward the horses. She hesitated, then climbed onto the bare back of the gentlest one, heart pounding. Her legs wobbled, her balance unsure. She fell twice. Each time, he helped her up without a word, brushing the dust from her sleeves, his touch careful. By the third try, she stayed on. They rode together through the tall grass, wind in their faces, the world stretching wide and open in every direction. That evening, Miriam sat beside her small shelter, brushing her fingers through her hair. It was tangled from the ride, from the wind, from weeks of worry. But she didn't pull it back like she used to, didn't hide it beneath a scarf. She reached for a carved comb and began to braid it slowly, carefully, her fingers steady. No shame in the motion, no fear in the strands. Someone passed by and called her name. Not witch, not cursed, just Miriam. Then another voice, softer, said healer. And it stuck, not as a title, but as truth. She looked up to see the sun dipping low, the sky burning orange and violet. Chaska stood a little ways off, watching her with something quiet in his eyes. She smiled. Not for him, not for show, but because it felt right too. Because something had grown from the ash, and this time, it was hers. The stars came out slow that night, one by one, quiet and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. The camp behind them settled into sleep, fires dimmed to soft glows, voices hushed into lullabies and breath. Chaska waited until the last of the drums faded, then looked at Miriam and nodded toward the ridge beyond the cedar trees. She didn't ask why. She simply followed. They walked without speaking, their steps soft on the worn path, the grass brushing their ankles like a blessing. The moon rose higher, casting silver light over the valley, turning the river below into a ribbon of light. When they reached the ridge, Chaska stopped and sat, his back straight, his gaze wide. Miriam joined him, drawing her knees up, folding her arms around them to keep the night air out. The wind carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, and far in the distance, an owl called once and then fell silent. For a long time, they didn't speak. She watched the stars shift above them, felt the earth steady beneath her, and wondered what he saw when he looked out across all that land. Then, without turning, he said her name, but it wasn't Miriam. Winona. Her breath caught. The word floated between them like a feather, light but full. She had heard it before, spoken softly at night when she was supposed to be asleep, woven into prayers she didn't understand. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't hidden, it was spoken aloud, given shape and weight, and it wasn't just a sound, it was a truth. She turned toward him, eyes searching his face. Why do you call me that? He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes deep and steady as the land they sat upon. He reached for her hand, not quickly, not timidly, but with care. He placed it against his chest, over the steady beat of his heart. Because you are not a curse, he said, his voice low but sure. You are the answer I didn't know I prayed for. The words settled into her like rain on dry earth. She had spent so long being feared, being blamed, being given away like a bad story no one wanted to tell again. But here, under stars that had watched both wars and weddings, he called her something else. Not because of what she'd done or failed to do, but because of who she was, what he saw when he looked at her and didn't turn away. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she even knew they were coming. Not heavy, not loud, just quiet drops of release. She didn't speak. There were no words big enough for what she felt. So she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder, and let the silence carry what her voice could not. He didn't move, just held her hand where it was, over his heart, under the stars, as if she belonged there. And for the first time she believed she did. The seasons turned the way they always did, slow and steady, the kind of change you only noticed if you stayed long enough to watch it. The sharp winds of winter softened into spring, bringing green shoots through blackened soil. Rain came gentle at first, then in bursts, and the river rose and sang louder than before. The valley, once marked by ash and fire, bloomed again, and so did Miriam. Her uncle was never seen again. No rider came asking. No letter arrived. If anyone knew what became of him, they kept it to themselves, and Miriam didn't ask. Some things were better left in the past, buried where they could no longer rot the air. She had stopped counting the days since he'd last said her name. She had stopped letting it belong to him at all. She stayed, not because she was trapped, not because she was lost, but because she chose to. This land, these people, this quiet strength that wrapped around her like a second skin, they were hers now. She built a garden beside the lodge. Small at first, nothing more than a patch of turned earth, but it grew. Herbs for healing, corn for bread, wildflowers just because she liked the color of them in the morning light. She knelt in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, hands dark with soil, and felt peace in the rhythm of it. Plant, water, wait, grow. The children still came, some older now, taller, louder, but they still brought her feathers and bright stones, still called her Winona with grins and tugged braids. She told them stories about foxes that could vanish into shadows and girls who turned into eagles when no one believed in them. And when she spoke, they listened like it mattered. The women of the camp no longer watched her with uncertain eyes. They asked her advice, invited her to share meals, trusted her hands with their sick and their newborns. They saw her not as the girl who arrived under smoke and fear, but as the woman who stayed when she didn't have to. Chaska was steady as always. He spoke little, smiled more, and never left without telling her when he'd return. They never talked about marriage, never stood before any fire to make a vow, but everyone knew. Their lives folded into one another's like two rivers meeting, no ceremony, just flow. In the mornings, he brought her fresh herbs from the hills. In the evenings, she rested against his shoulder as the fire cracked low. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. Once a trader asked Chaska why he'd taken in the girl they used to call cursed. Chaska looked toward the garden, where Miriam crouched, brushing dirt from a leaf, her face turned toward the sun. Then he said simply, "She walks with life now." And she did. Sometimes Miriam stood at the creek and stared down at her reflection, her hair long and wild, her skin sun-kissed, her eyes steady, not beautiful by the world's measure, but whole. She didn't look away anymore. She smiled, not because the mirror told her to, not because someone else said she should, but because everything she saw belonged to her. And at last, that was enough. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of love, redemption, and strength. Every click helps us share more voices that deserve to be heard.